Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to the final episode of, at least for now, of a Tolkien fan's impressions of Rings of Power. This, of course, is the impression of the last episode, Alloyed. Although I highly doubt it will be the last of these, since I'm almost certain that Amazon will make a second series, given how well the series has done thus far in terms of viewership. So, to start us off, I think I'll talk about the one storyline which wasn't included, which was the Dwarven one. Of course, we talked about that in the previous episode. I find it interesting that they don't really continue that here, instead leaving the Dwarven sequence in kind of a limbo after Durin, the prince, has been disinherited, and kind of almost a brewing Cold War, if not civil conflict, going on between Durin and his father. Given that that's how it was left, my guess is that will pick up in the next season and will at some point almost certainly lead to the unleashing of the Balrog in whatever way that happens. I will be very interested to see whether the writers go in terms of that storyline in a more House of the Dragon-esque, Game of Thrones-esque political struggle, or whether they'll cleave more to the sort of traditional high fantasy roots of the Lord of the Rings. I guess we'll see. But to round off a few of the Númenórean storylines, which are not that important in this episode, but do bear discussing. The death of the king is important, since it sort of signals the end of the authority. And I think what's going to happen next is that Pharazôn is going to usurp the throne, particularly now that Muriel is blind. I think that will give him an excuse to try and seize the kingdom for himself. I also liked the reference to the Númenóreans' fear of death, which is a feature of their culture which hasn't really been shown in Rings of Power thus far, particularly. I think they might make it more of a thing that Pharazôn brings to Númenor in this series, rather than being a pre-existing part of Númenorian culture, which in some ways is a shame, but is also understandable to try and give Pharazôn more of an important role. We finally have a specific plotline for Isildur's sister Arianne as well, which is great because I wasn't sure why that plot line with her and Pharazôn's son was necessary. I'm still not quite sure, but it's clear they're setting her up for bigger things in the next season. And her connection to the Palantir will be interesting. They leave that storyline on something of a cliffhanger. We don't even get to see her actually look into the Palantir. So I guess we'll have to wait and see. So yes, we have some storylines converging in Númenor. We have the return of Muriel, defeated and blinded. We have Elendil returning to Númenor. And of course we have Arianne and her story with the Palantir, and Pharazôn. Of course, the other thing that I haven't yet mentioned is the sort of tying in of the Númenórean storyline to the faithful, and the idea of being faithful to the elves and the Valar versus Pharazôn, who is not. And of course, this is in the Silmarillion. This is a much bigger thing. It sort of cleaves Númenórean society into two different groups. It doesn't seem to be quite so bad yet in Rings of Power, but it's also clear that that division will only grow. And given how Númenor ends, it seems likely to me that the overall structure of the story to come with Númenor, we know. I'd say of all of the storylines here, the Númenórean one cleaves the most closely to the original Silmarillion. So I think we sort of know how it's going to end. Although I will be interested to see what happens to Muriel, and indeed what Isildur's storyline will be, because of course he's not dead, as we know as the readers. As the viewers, he can't be dead, since he has to defeat Sauron for the first time. So presumably he will end up becoming a figure on his own in the second series. I wonder if they might take him down the direction of that scrapped concept for an Aragorn TV show following Aragorn's adventures, because having Isildur alone in the Southlands would make for quite a good season, maybe half a season of just adventuring, Middle-earth sightseeing, maybe seeing the founding of Minas Morgul, for example, or seeing Shelob with some fan service. I can see them wanting him there to sort of give a look into the creation of Mordor as we know it. And I would say thus far, and I'll come back to this later on, that overall I think that Rings of Power has done a good job in balancing fan service with the desire to tell an original story. So although I would be somewhat unnerved if that was an idea by itself, I think as part of the broader Rings of Power show, I think it could work quite well. So that's enough about Numenor, because again, that wasn't really the main thrust of this story. In fact, there were two main story thrusts for this episode. Surprisingly, not that much in comparison to the previous episode, but of course that did have a lot of its own story to cover. So this one just has two main storylines. The storyline with the elves and the creation of the rings, and the storyline with the Harfoots and with the person who we now know as the Blue Wizard. So I should say that when I first saw the three spirits, evil spirits, call Istar, I'll call him Istar for this, Sauron, my immediate sense was this seems like a fake out, because it just didn't feel right with where they'd gone with that character. I could have believed that he was secretly Sauron if this was episode 3 or 4, but given everything that we'd known about him, and particularly the way that he'd healed the tree in the previous episode, knowing what I know about the way that evil works in Tolkien's universes, the idea of evil doing something good, the idea of evil being able to bear fruit, is very much not something that Tolkien ever accepted. He viewed evil as ultimately a twisted parody, a corruption of goodness. So evil cannot do good things, really, in Tolkien's universe. That isn't a reflection on his personal morals, I don't know, but within The Lord of the Rings, that is how it works. So the idea that he could be Sauron seemed wrong to me. This was proven correct. I do find it somewhat silly that the evil spirits have apparently been looking for this guy they think is Sauron, and they can't tell that he's actually an Istari. That seems a bit, I guess whatever, it's fine. It works for the story, but you would have thought that they would have been able to know that this guy wasn't evil. Although it might be, given that we're going to follow his character, it might be that we discover more about him that makes that perhaps a bit more understandable from their perspective. I noticed also the focus on the staff, the idea of the staff and the wizard staff, how it was the leader of the evil spirits had their own staff, and that staff was then instrumental in banishing all of them. So I'm guessing we'll see Istar make his own staff at some point. And yes, it's pretty clear that he is one of the Blue Wizards, as we know from Tolkien's notes, in both versions of the story of the Blue Wizards. Whether they are ultimately a negative or a positive force in the world, Tolkien himself didn't really give us a full answer on that. He sort of flip-flopped between the two. Either way, they end up going into the East. And I'm guessing the way they've written Istar's character, they will end up with him becoming a force for good and trying to quell Sauron's influence in Run. In terms of the Harfoots themselves, the death of Sadok was well done, I thought. The idea of him kind of accepting his fate and being with his friends at the end in a very understated way was quite powerful. The line, I would just like to wait for the sun to come up, it reminded me personally a lot of the famous line from Scott of the Antarctic, I'm just going out now, I may be some time, when he, knowing that he was going to die, sacrificed himself to try and save his colleagues. And that was the same vibe, although obviously not as tragic, given that his colleagues don't die, Sadok's friends don't die, but it's the same kind of idea of an understated, respectful death, which was a good send-off for the character. The fight sequence itself was overall really good. I love a good wizard duel. Who doesn't? And it's nice to see a show that has the budget to make magic look really cool. And the very elemental powers of the Istar, the powers of the wind, particularly, was, and then the fire of the leader of the evil spirits was quite a good and fun combination. Don't really have much to say about that aside from I really enjoyed it. It gave me flashes of the fight between Saruman and Gandalf in Fellowship of the Ring, but different, and again more elemental, more natural. It works. Nori joining Istar on his travels is the obvious, but I think also the best end for her character for this season. Rediscovering her joy and adventuring and wanting to be more than just a Harfoot. Honestly, I couldn't really fault that. I thought they'd set her character up very nicely for that. I was somewhat surprised that Poppy didn't join her, and it makes me think that maybe they have plans to continue following the Harfoots in the next season, because honestly, everything that we know about Poppy's character, particularly her friendship with Nori, tells me that her natural endpoint would have been to follow Nori on her adventures. So the fact that she doesn't do that tells me that the writers have more in store for her as a character. And they might have felt it was too similar to the Frodo-Sam relationship. I have no doubt, though, that they will reunite at some point in the future. So that's one major storyline out of the way. I very much liked it. I thought it did a good job. The red herring was a little bit obvious for my taste, but I think that it ends the series for the Harfoots and for Istar on a good note, and I'm very interested to see where the two storylines go from here, and Nori and Istar's adventures in the East. So now we come on to the major storyline, the biggest storyline of this episode, and I think I have intentionally not looked at anyone else's opinion of this episode. I looked at no reviews or anything because I wanted to get my thoughts down here now before I read other people's, because I can tell that this is going to be controversial. That it's a decision to make Halbrand Sauron and the decision to have the 3 elven rings be forged now. I will be honest here, as somebody who loves Lord of the Rings, who loves the Silmarillion, who loves the Hobbit, who loves the wider world of Arda, it is still my favourite, I'd say, fictional universe. I actually really liked it. I thought it was really clever. I thought that the way that they depicted Sauron and the way in which little bits and pieces that they had scattered throughout the series came back in Halbrand's character. His temptation of Galadriel, I thought all of that was actually very much in line with the way Sauron is presented in Silmarillion, and to some extent in Lord of the Rings, although he's not really in that as a character per se. I think that the obvious criticism is that, the Lord of Gifts, Anatar, in the Silmarillion, or in the appendices of the Lord of the Rings, is, meant to look like an elf lord. However, I don't think it's wrong to have him look like a human. I don't think that's wrong. I think it plays with the audience's expectations, particularly those like me who were expecting Anatar to look a certain way. But it also makes a lot of sense. It makes sense in the context of, what's going on, that a humble man would be actually in some ways a better guise for Sauron than an elf lord or a Magi. And I think also I've criticised Halbrand's character in the previous episodes, but in a way, this recontextualizes it. Yes, having him be, a king of the Southlands, a sort of throwback to Aragorn, was silly, but the writers clearly understood that because that whole thing was a front. Galadriel becoming more suspicious of Halbrand, I would say, was a little bit... How do I say this? It felt a bit rushed, and again, I've mentioned before, but I do think this would have been better as a 10-episode, not an 8-episode series, because having at least one extra episode of tension between Halbrand and Galadriel would have made it feel a little bit less sudden. But still, I really like how this recontextualizes a lot of conflict between, for example, Adar and Halbrand. Does Adar know that Halbrand is Sauron? Does Adar genuinely believe he killed Sauron? Maybe he does. What's in store for Adar now that Sauron has returned? Because Halbrand clearly hates Adar. So, we will see. The way that Halbrand uses Galadriel's words against her, even though taken out of context and got by trickery, is also clever. Again, I think some people will have an issue with the idea of Halbrand trying to make Galadriel his queen, but I don't personally think that's really what's going on there. Like, Sauron is not really wanting to make her his queen. What he's doing is he's tempting her with the desire for power. Because first, he tempts her with the memory of her brother. And when she refuses that, he then tempts her with power. It's not really about marrying him. It's about the power she would gain. And that's what he then tries to tempt her with after he fails with taking on her brother's form. And then, of course, once that fails, he then tries to drown her in the river. So, I actually really liked that twist. I didn't see it coming, but I didn't see it coming in a way that when I look back at Halbrand's character and when I rewatch the series, I will appreciate it. It wasn't a twist that I felt was the kind of twist that had no build-up. There was quite a lot of build-up to it. It's just build-up that I didn't necessarily recognise at the time. I also thought Halbrand being a smith, coming back, was clever. And the way that he presented himself to Celebrimbor as somebody in need of tutoring was also clever. The gift aspect perhaps was a little on the nose, maybe, but I didn't understand that at the time. I hadn't considered how that would play into the Lord of Gifts aspect of Sauron, but again, I thought it was good. I genuinely thought it was good. I thought it was a good, engaging way to, remix what happens with the creation of the rings, rather than just adapt it beat for beat. And I'm perfectly fine with that, particularly because, of course, as we know, they can't use the original version for a number of reasons. So why not make it a bit different, a bit quirky? Why not make it unique? I liked it. I will say that I'm not the biggest fan of the design of the rings. I thought they seemed a little not ethereal enough, not otherworldly enough in my opinion. But overall, I thought the whole sequence of making them was well done. I thought the way that Galadriel had to give up the dagger was well done. And I will be interested to see what happens now that Elrond basically knows. I did think it was quite funny and clever to have the final scene for them just be Celebrimbor smiling down, oblivious at his rings, and Elrond and Galadriel having a kind of a, well, what now moment between the two of them. So yes, I guess in closing, I may do a recap of the whole series at some point. But in closing, my overall feelings on the show are positive, actually. I thought it got better as it went along. I thought that a lot of the earlier and more kind of silly stuff, like the Great Worm and aspects like that, were, they were ironed out over time. The storylines got better and more interesting. They came together in more interesting ways. I still think they should have been 10 episodes, and I still think certain plot lines should have been cut, others given more room to breathe. But overall, I thought it was a good adaptation of the source material as far as they were allowed to do that. I thought that it kept the spirit of the original work and the themes, temptation, friendship, love of nature, the importance of the little people of the world. I thought all of that shone through very well. In some ways, and this might be somewhat controversial, I actually think that some of those themes, like particularly friendship and the importance of community, actually came through better in Rings of Power than did in the original film trilogy. Because it was more done directly through the relationship between Gimli and Legolas, which was fine, but it was also often played for laughs. Whereas here, I would say that the idea of friendship between elves and dwarves, I mentioned this more in the previous episode, but I thought that came through really well with Durin and Elrond, and I thought that the themes there of familial ties and friendship and the interlocking intricacies of how people deal with their friends versus their family, what it means to call someone a brother or not, that I think in many ways was done better actually in this adaptation than in the original film trilogy. Which is fine, because the original film trilogy did a lot of things much better than Rings of Power. So, yes, I don't think it's as good as the original film trilogy, but I do think it did certain things better. And I am very interested to see where the series goes from here. Where they will take Mordor, where they will take Istar and Nori, and where they will take the elves and dwarves. Because we have yet to see the forging of the dwarven, human, and Sauron's rings. And I foresee interesting difficulties given the political situation in Khazad-dûm. And I wonder if that will become the major focus of the next season. Although it does depend, because of course in Tolkien's original work, the sacking of Hollin Eregion happens before the downfall of Khazad-dûm. And there's Khazad-dûm shuts its gates to the survivors, which is important as well. So I wonder if they will keep that timeline or whether they will change it around, as they have changed around quite a lot of the timeline here. But again, I'm interested to see where it goes. I very much enjoyed the last episode. And please let me know in the comments, what do you think? Where do you think the series will go from here? Did you like the final episode? Did you like what they did with Sauron, the temptation and the making of the rings? Do you agree with me that it fits in with the original concepts and themes? Or did you have a different opinion? Would you have preferred it to be more akin to the depiction of Tolkien's original concept? So, please let me know, and I hope you enjoyed this series. Hope you enjoyed Rings of Power, and I'll definitely be back to do my impressions of the next season whenever it comes out. Thank you. Goodbye.